We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio. I remain Mark Angelides. We continue our conversation with John Klar. John, just before the break, we were talking about the lack of diversity of thought within the globalist apparatus. Do you want to carry on that thought?
Oh, I'll carry on for sure. I call it the Borg. And I would actually differ with you a little bit, because it does quell diversity of thought in the name of having the elitist, highest level of enlightened thought ever. But that doesn't allow for that diversity of cultures. You know, I study farming. Not all farming is the same in America. I'm in Vermont. We have a lot of water, long winters. You go out west, they have to pump the water out of the ground. They don't have to worry about winters. In fact, right now they're trying to get their lambing done so they won't cook in the sun in Arizona. I often think about the Scots. I love Scotland. They wear kilts. They have quite the history of battle tales, even against the Romans. And then they throw poles around. Well, big poles that they throw in the air if nobody. And
Tossing the caber, for those unfamiliar.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Yes, sir. I've watched it in fascination, and I like snooker. Now, what I see in Scotland is multiculturalism ultimately is the destroyer of culture, of local culture. And I picked Scotland because if I were to try to defend my Vermont culture, then I guess I'd be called a nativist or you know, that I'm somehow a racist. And I pick up, how about the Japanese? They're imposing restrictions on who can work there because they want people that will preserve their language. The French have passed laws. You can't say French fries. The Italians are passing laws to protect their food. These are what shapes identity. And to refer to Wendell Berry again, he talks about how we're culturally connected, particularly to the soil and farming, and just look at the diverse histories within just Europe. And then to take those and try to combine them in a global Borg with totally different religious views and what have you. And as Victor Davis Hanson points out, this is what defines a nation. And here in America, that's how it relates to the undocumented aliens. If they're not complying with our laws and they're undermining the rule of law, and if they're not interested in assimilating in your culture, then your culture will not survive. And that seems to be the plan of some, as Murray points out. So I think you're hitting the nail right on the head. I think that preserving culture is just as important. If you're going to have diversity, you have to have those cultures intact and not denigrate and then crash them with a wrecking ball. And that's the balance that's out of balance. And how do you, looking at the numbers for the UK and the number of people not born there who do not believe in separation of church and state, for instance, who have a totally different worldview, how do you assimilate? How does that country survive and create a unifying culture as well as economy and other things with that kind of tension? And I think we see it all over the world. You're quite right.
Yeah, it's almost Europe is the canary in the coal mine, with England being the lead canary there, the advanced force of canaries, in terms of there's a certain element of society that wishes to see the destruction of all that held Britain together over the period of, well, it depends how long you want to go back in history, but from 1066 is essentially where, I mean, that's when we count our kings and queens from, is 1066, although obviously we had some rather amazing and some great ones, for those of you who know your history, before 1066. And there's a very clear message that's coming from the people who want to bury English culture, British culture, and that is that there's a sin that is at the heart of the United Kingdom, Britain, England specifically, even though obviously it was also with the Scots, and that is the empire building that took place all those years ago. And it seems that these people, and they are people who are in the upper echelons of power, and they are people who are just arrived on boats, who have this idea in their head that England and the English are a deeply racist, deeply colonialist past people who don't deserve their own country. And that's my worry, is that people are being taught this kind of stuff in schools. And so you've got a whole generation growing up with this mind virus that people aren't just worth what they're worth based on their morality, their intrinsic value, their outlook, how they help other people, how they protect their families, but they are lumped in with a class just because, the color of their skin, their ancestors 300 years ago, who, let's be fair, most people's ancestors 300 years ago were peasants. And that's what we all were, right? There's only a few who weren't, and those people are still living the high life in the palaces. What's the cure? There's a big question for you, John. What's the cure?
Well, the cure is the truth. This is all built on lies. And actually, to quote Barry again, he calls it historical pride. I dealt with it here in Vermont. Vermont was the first state in the world, actually, because it was a state at the time to make, so we actually beat the British to it. We don't have to argue about that in Wilberforce, but in the 1790s to ban slavery. Right. And then we just had an amendment to our Constitution because it allowed for indentured servitude. So there were whole big tirades in our state legislature by progressive, so-called, saying, oh, well, it wasn't good enough. And somehow they would have been more enlightened then, they think, than those people, when they're not even that enlightened now. And so there is this arrogance, and it's false about the yes, of course, both of our countries have had times of perhaps embarrassing tragedies. Does that mean we throw out the whole model? The whole thing has been aspirational. What the British did to try to, perhaps in repentance, spend many lives and much treasure, and Murray talks about this in his book, to wipe out the global slave trade and the history of the Barbary pilots, and the fact that they were also taking white people off the coasts by maybe millions from the UK and taking them away. Well, that's part of the history. And the history of, Americans having killed the American Indians and given them blankets to give them smallpox on purpose, that's not true. The whole, 1619 project is a rewrite of history. And so every culture is defined in part by their history. And we do wrangle with how to most truthfully tell it. But the American experience is not just the experience of slavery, it's the experience of abolitionism. And this morning I saw someone attacking Bobby Kennedy and me for supporting him for HHS, because they said, how could you support somebody who is a drug addict? And I said, well, I work with drug addicts. He deserves credit for that. Do you understand how difficult it is to surmount that? This isn't even the blackface. We're going to actually punish people for the sins of their great-grandfathers? Ultimately, that is the new racism, the new eugenics, the statement that because you're white, you are therefore subconsciously racist, whether you know it or not. And if you're male, you're patriarchal. Even if you're, very sick and have spent 30 years working for the poor, it doesn't matter. And you can grovel all you want. You can never redeem yourself from it. That's what we've moved away from, Mark, here in this country. And look at what the UK is doing with stifling speech, because heaven forbid you could speak freely, you might challenge the lie. So free speech allows truth. Truth defeats lies. That's what we see in America, where every demographic group has shifted towards the right, even particularly and notably the Black and Hispanic people that have been preyed upon and exploited by the left, who then didn't do anything for them. They're waking up to the fact that they're being played, that racism is being used to exploit them for the power of technocrats and those who benefit from the lies. And so the common people have to return to becoming educated about the truth. And if they don't stand up for it, well, then they become proles, right? To reference Orwell.
The truth shall indeed set you free. John Klar, thanks ever so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
And that's all we have time for this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guests today, Lisa K. Donner and John Klar. And of course, extend my gratitude to you, the listeners at home, for taking the time to join us each and every week. Please do remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse campaigns, candidates, or legislation. And this presentation is no endorsement. Thanks for being here.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.